Hi, it's Zahra, and I hope everybody is planning to go to the No Kings protest this weekend in your town. Um, I turned 51 in a few days, so it's my birthday weekend, but I'm still planning to go. And I know for most radicals, it seems pretty pointless. But I think right now, the situation we're in the country has a bunch of overlapping realities to it. Like, you could be like, fascists don't really care about some peaceful protest. But on the other hand, like, a lot of the people sort of going along with it, maybe from mainstream Republicans to other people who are uneasy with how extreme things are, could possibly just be swayed by numbers. Not because of elections, but just because they might get a little bit more bravery just in the numbers. And I think that's part of it. It can also, in small conservative towns, make people feel like they can speak out more, which can be a good thing. Yes, in liberal areas, it does seem pointless, but just having those numbers on the news could be useful. And I know the news is kind of compromised these days. So there's a lot of things to weigh. And I feel like protests in general are like that. Like, I was looking at some people's posts about like trying to keep the protests peaceful. And it reminded me of all the issues with protests going back to when I protested against the first Gulf War in like 91 or something. And we did civil disobedience training and all sort of got arrested, blocking a recruitment center. And I don't know what difference it made. But I was involved in activism for years after that. And I remember one protest, it might have been over People's Park in Berkeley, or it was around the time of the Rodney King riots, where there was some like, pretty radical anarchist group meeting to discuss like actions. And if, like, we shouldn't like engage with the police, we shouldn't do this. And I've been hitchhiking around the country and like was in that space. And one of the kids I was with like ran up and kicked the window in on a police car. And it was like, we didn't vote for this. And it's like, you don't have control over what people do, right? Like, even if you're the radical group that thinks that you're the one that's going to carry out actions, like the kid I was with, like, I guess he grew up as a carny. He was like a street level drug dealer. He hated the police, right? Like, it's not like he was working for the groups that might have planned the protest at the time. You don't really have control over people. You do have control over your response. So if people are angry over the Rodney King riots, you can like condemn the police, or you can condemn the protesters, or you can do something in between. And I think that's where you run into problems when we start moving towards actual fascism, because you can be like, no, we need to keep this optic. And it's coming from this very middle class privileged perspective of how people see things, and that the status quo is somehow better than anything that could come out of the protest. So it's like, we don't want to give them reason to bring in the military, which makes sense. Like in Portland, like all this sort of funny animal stuff sort of makes sense that it doesn't justify bringing in the military. But you can say, well, the fascists will bring in the military anyways, which might be true. But you can also sort of say that maybe they won't bring in the military, but are you really preventing ICE actions by doing these things that kind of make it harder for the military to come in? Because it sort of seems so silly that you're like, well, there's not, rioting happening in Portland. And I feel like the mainstream narrative has been influenced by all those frog costumes, where it's harder for Trump to get the media narrative to send the troops in, but he doesn't necessarily need it. But the question is, like, does it protect immigrants, right? Like, you can hold all the signs you want, be out in the street and have numbers, but if, like, around the corner, they're rounding up your neighbors, it's not really doing anything. So I think there's a lot of levels where it's like, well, we don't want to justify, troops in the streets, but at the same time, a status quo of people getting stuck in these weird detention camps is not acceptable either. And I'm not really saying what side to take, but I feel like it's worth people exploring all those different sides in their head. Same with security culture, which I've always had an issue with, is you can be like, we shouldn't, be public about being activists, and don't put your name on a list, because you need to be able to do your activism and go back to work. and not have, the government looking for you. But at the same time, if that keeps you quiet and, you're posting about all the great advances in AI over on LinkedIn and at work, you're never talking about politics, but then you're going and being radical in the street, is that really more radical than someone who's willing to bring their politics into the workplace when civil society has a lot more power than a bunch of kids in the streets to slow things down? And you could see that when the pushback on Kimmel was sort of more consumers, but civil society has a lot more power than rioting. The problem is civil society is a lot more likely to just go over to the fascists, like you can see with Benioff. So I don't know, just some random thoughts for the day.